Logan, have you ever toyed with the notion of going back and trying to write in the traditional sense again? Rchrd Sl. No, not really. Right now I'm happy doing what I'm doing. Logan, a lot of your earlier work is shorter. Does have a sort of Edward Gorey feel to the rhythm. You've lately moved to longer works. How did that transition? Rchrd Sl. My favorite writer is Kafka, and I was kind of going for that oddly detached quality he has, even when writing about the most awful things. I was also reading lots of Borges and Grimm's fairy tales, so when I sat down to write, what would come out was usually in a short story format. And when my comics began being published in anthologies, then suddenly more and more anthologies would ask me to contribute. That was fine because I didn't really have any ideas for ongoing comic book series of my own. And doing nothing but short pieces for anthologies allowed me to start getting work as an illustrator. So there I was with a master's degree and no money and a painting studio in East Oakland warehouse, a day job at a university library, part-time career as an illustrator, and a few hours left in the week to work on comics. Eventually, I gave up the painting studio and I began making more money doing illustrations part-time than working at my day job. I quit the library. 2. Then I became pretty much an illustrator first and a comic artist second. At one point, I did serialized work for Dark Horse Comics. I'd gotten a tiny flicker of attention for an animated serial on MTV's Liquid Television called Invisible Hands, and the idea was to do a comic with a similar tongue-in-cheek pulp mystery serial for an anthology Dark Horse was starting called Deadline USA. So I did 13 O'Clock, which was eventually collected into one-shot Dark Horse comic. I was also getting more into rediscovering and rereading all the stuff I loved as a child, especially all the pulp reprint paperbacks like The Shadow and The Spider. All my old comics and monster magazines were still in boxes at my mom's house in Arizona, so I asked her to send them, and that led to a real reawakening of interest in all of that. But aside from 13 O'Clock, I was only doing short pieces. All along I'd been doing them for myself, for my own enjoyment. I was in a lot of really good anthologies like J.D. King's Twist and Monty Benchmonk's Blab, but I was also in a lot of awful ones too, and that was always disheartening. One of the things I learned as a beginning illustrator was not to turn down any assignment. So you did, they might not. So if you did, they might never call you again. So it got to be the same with comics for anthologies. I usually said yes, and not so much because I was afraid they'd never call again, but because I was so grateful to have the opportunity to do comics for publication. How could I say no? And I always had ideas for stories. But then I started to get burned out on the comic scenes. There was a new anthology from Canada called Drawn and Quarterly, and they'd asked me to contribute. They were going to be printing in color, and at that time I hadn't done any strips in color, so I happily came on board. But when the issue came out, the color had been printed horribly and the strips looked awful. Chris, the editor, assured me that they'd improved the color printing, but in the meantime, he said maybe I could use brighter colors so they wouldn't fade out so much. I did, but issue after issue I kept hoping, you see. The color looked worse and worse. It was heartbreaking. I stopped caring towards the end about the color work. I stopped caring towards the end about the color work I was turning into Drawn and Quarterly. I did one black and white strip for them that is one of my favorites, but no one else seemed to like, called Time Bomb, which was pretty indicative of where my head was at the time, i.e. pretty crazy. I remember all that as being my first experience with knowingly turning in work that I felt was substandard. It was depressing, and I was doing so well with illustration work, always busy, that I started turning down comic anthologies. The only one I continued to work for a while was Blab, because Monte was always sure the work looked good. Because Monte always made sure the work looked good. The irony is, little did I know that Drawn and Quarterly would eventually lead the field in publishing and really great-looking books. I had the bad luck of being there before they got the bugs worked out. Anyways, although I'd pretty much stopped doing comics, I was still writing and planning and trying other things. I did a small press book called The Ghastly Ones, for example, and I hoped would be more suited to the bookstores than comic book stores. It wasn't a comic, it was a sort of an old-fashioned illustrated humor book based on those old William Steig books, like The Lonely Ones. Get it? Finally, it occurred to me that the illustrations might just be the creative dead end I had always prided myself on working well with. Uh, Finally, it occurred to me that the illustration might be a creative dead end. I had always prided myself on working well with art directors. Hey, it's a collaborative effort. But as the years went on, some some of the little criticisms and editorial remarks got harder to take. There is so much swallowing of one's pride. If you are a 35-year-old illustrator with 15 years of work under your belt, and you find yourself being given vague, nitpicky instructions on how to improve your drawings by a 23-year-old designer/art director who has absolutely no art background, well, if you are a sensitive type, it can start to get to you. Then I happened to get the perfect call at the perfect time. Kim Thompson at Fantagraphics was starting a new anthology called 00 and was doing the usual cattle call for contributors. I told Kim I was interested, but I didn't want to do short pieces. I wanted to do serial. My plan was to do a long continuing story that I could eventually publish as a graphic novel. Kim said yes, and I'd be forever grateful to him for that. So that was my first graphic novel, The Chuckling Whatsit. Because doing that had given me so much pleasure, I asked Kim if Fantagraphics would consider giving me an ongoing series, a place where I could serialize another graphic novel. Again, to my relief, he said okay, but advised me to not only have the serial, but include other material, stories that would be complete in one issue, because serials often alienate readers. Since I didn't want to do a stand-alone short stories, I came up with a character named Peculia, who in every issue would have self-contained adventures. So in that way, I eventually, out of the series, which was called Evil Eye, I got 2 books. I got to publish my serialized story as a graphic novel called Mad Night, and I was able to release a collection of backup stories called Peculia. After the serial had concluded in Evil Eye number 12, we decided to reformat the title into a series of graphic novellas. In today's marketplace, it makes more sense to produce work that can be sold in bookstores and on Amazon.com rather than just in whatever comics shop decides to carry 1 or 2 copies of it. I'm tremendously grateful to the comic stores who have supported my work over the years, like Comic Relief and Meltdown, by the way, more than I can ever say. So the first of these, Evil Eye number 13, was a Peculia adventure called Peculia and the Groongrove Vampires. The second will be published later in 2006, is called The Grave Robber's Daughter.